Hey folks, it's Sam coming to you from sunny San Diego, talking about the biggest differences between Western and Vedic astrology. And I'm talking about this because people have asked me for quite a while. I was going to get more of a presentation together. I'm going to be doing quite a bit more on this, especially on the zodiacs here in the next few weeks, because I'm finishing a book on. It's called A Concise History of the Zodiacs, where I'm going to be talking about that specific issue a little bit more. But today I'm going to be talking about zodiacs as one big difference, the calculation, but also the conceptual differences. Some of that is implicit in the calculations that are used for the zodiac in the East as opposed to in Western astrology. Talk a little bit about the history of how those things developed. But then, on a more practical matter, how people who are doing Western astrology can understand the Vedic approach. And that includes different ways that the charts are read and things like that. So, of course, one of the biggest differences that people notice right away, of course, is that the chart looks different because of the different calculation. And of course, it is true, and it's really not anything but a factual assertion that the astrology that came out of India was sidereal based. It just means it's based on the sky, not on taking the calculation of the Earth going around the sun and projecting that into the sky in order to measure the zodiac circle. In India, they had two calculations. They called them chakras, wheels. There were two wheels. The Nirayana chakra, which is the sky without the ayana, and the Sayana zodiac, or Sayana chakra, I'm sorry. Zodiac isn't the word. Zodiac is a Greek term. Or the Sayana chakra, the wheel with the seasons. And everything that was related to the seasons was also related to the year and the months and things that had to do with the calendar. All of that was measured with the Sayana chakra. That's how all of that thing was organized, because it was connected to the calendar. The way you measured that was with the Nirayana chakra, which was the sky. So everything that you are measuring, moving through the sky, you're measuring it with the Nirayana chakra, with the sky, against the stars, the Nakshatras. And that even includes the ayanas. They were measuring the ayanamsha, or where the solstice points were happening as well. They were also measuring that with the Nirayana chakra, or what we would now call sidereal zodiac. Again, sidereal and tropical zodiacs, these are Western ideas. Indian ideas are Nirayana and Sayana chakra. And even the Sayana chakra was measured with the Nirayana chakra. Okay? So this is in every Vedic astrology text. It's reflected in all of the texts across all disciplines, the astronomical texts, all of it. This maintains. Certain examples where they do talk about, again, what we would now call tropical zodiac, which is not the term or the concept, but in certain instances, especially after a certain point, they started using zodiac sign names to also describe things that had to do with the calendar. And of course, this led to confusion. I'm not going to get into that here. Suffice to say that you should understand that, again, in every Vedic astrology text, from Brihat Parashara Sastra to Brihat Jataka to Brihat Samhita, it's reaffirmed, to Jataka Parijata, to Yavana Jataka, to Horasara, to every Vedic astrology text where the zodiac is measured, is stated, because it's not always stated either, but they'll either state the zodiac, or they'll refer to an author who did, or they just don't mention it because it's just common knowledge. It was always sidereal based or aligned with nakshatras. So, the direction is always the same as well. It'll say the planets, the sky is measured in nakshatras, because nakshatras are the original measurement, and that's the original sidereal measurement, what we call sidereal measurement. And the rashis occupy the same space, or they're aligned, or Aries and Ashwini are there. Every one of them that says it says that without fail. So that's not a debatable point. If you're doing the astrology of India, it's sidereal based, what we would call sidereal. And of course, Western astrology isn't, because over the years, what happened is, back in the, as the Greeks were establishing their astrological tradition, right as they were establishing it, their culture, the Hellenistic Alexandrian culture, was sort of simultaneously getting decimated by the Romans and by incursions, and a lot of stuff got lost and confused and sort of discombobulated in the West. The Western astrological system is much more of a forked road. And what was the ancient Western astrology, which was in Greece, was very similar to the Vedic astrology. It was sidereal based. All the ancient Greek astrologers were using sidereal as well. But it was also proposed in the 2nd century that the zodiac is actually joined the seasons. And it was proposed in a book called Tetrabiblos, but this wasn't really put into practice until hundreds of years later, when the when the Persians translated the book Tetrabiblos into Arabic. And so the earliest versions even of Tetrabiblos that we have are from the 9th century in Arabic. We don't even have the early Greek versions of it. And it was at that time, around the 8th, 9th century, that you really started to see a committed hard fork in the astrological traditions toward tropical, where they fixed the zodiac on the vernal equinox. And that's really the origin of the Western astrology tradition. Even more so than ancient Greece was Persia, because then that migrated into Europe, and then it picked up the sort of medieval tradition of astrology in Europe, in Rome, and then in England, and all throughout Europe. Of course, there was still an earlier tradition of Greece, but again, that was broken. Some of it was exported into Europe for sure, and a lot of the texts, some of the texts were translated into Latin and all. But again, the tradition really kind of fell apart and got reconstituted in Persia, and then they started using tropical. Now, in between the two parts, the Persians actually learned astrology from India. They studied the Surya Siddhanta for several hundred years. So again, just a little history lesson. Again, some people are always saying, "Oh, I'm confused. I only understand this." Again, everything I do isn't for absolute beginners. If you're too confused, I'm sorry. I'm going to explain a little bit of it, though, just so you can understand. And by the way, the things I'm saying here right now, these aren't my opinions. These are in every textbook, every research paper you've ever seen, everyone who's ever looked at the actual research. There's nothing confusing or controversial about this at all. All right? From Indian scholars, Western scholars, there's a whole branch of ancient archaeoastronomy, ancient mathematical astronomy, an entire branch of science devoted to this now that started in Brown University in like the 40s or 50s. People like Otto Neugebauer, David Pingree, van der Werden, all of these people deciphered and went back and looked at all of this. What I'm telling you is just a very kind of quick version of the history of how the zodiacs sort of changed. Again, you can fact check any of this or go look it up yourself. I recommend you do it. There are academic websites like academia.edu, JSTOR. Wikipedia is actually a good resource for overall subjects like this, and then you can especially go to the bottom and see all of the footnotes. So it's not controversial at all to understand that there were two distinct traditions that developed. And again, nothing controversial about this. It's, again, just a historical fact. And you see these two traditions that developed. Indians never changed their relationship with the sky directly, what we would call sidereal. And then eventually what we would now call Western astrology moved over to what we would call tropical after the Persian influence, and then translating the ancient Greek texts into Arabic. Then they reconstituted the zodiac and they fixed it on the vernal equinox. And then a tradition developed based on that. So you have these two distinct calculations based on these two distinct traditions. So that's one of the biggest differences, like historically, in Western and Vedic astrology. Now, again, it shows up in the zodiac because the calculation. So the Western astrology chart, again, it's not based on the sky directly, right? And even in the ancient world, there were 12 portions of the sky in the zodiac, but and there were sort of constellations, sort of figurines that were projected into the sky based on that. But that's not the important part. Those 12 sections of the sky are segregated sections of the sky that are 12 30-degree portions. That's always the way the sky is reckoned sidereally. It's not those constellations. Some are bigger than others. What about that? Well, so what? It doesn't matter. It's 12 segregated portions of the sky. Those figurines were just incidental as kind of like a mnemonic to remember what the energy is. So in Western astrology, though, they don't base it on the sky. They start the chart on the vernal equinox. That's the first day of Aries. Again, even though that's really connected to the calendar, it's joined the calendar. Because again, the vernal equinox is something that's related to the calendar. A zodiac is something in the sky, right? So they're different things. Again, it's not a right or wrong. It's just a simple acknowledgement of fact. And Western astrology, this is why their chart is about 24 degrees further advanced than what you would see in Western astrology. And again, it's always moving. So, 700 years ago, it was 10 degrees less. So 700 years ago, instead of it being 24 degrees forward, it was 14 degrees forward. 700 years before that, it was only about 4 degrees forward, because about 1 degree every 70 years. So every 700 years, it moves about 10 degrees, the eye nuptia, and it'll keep doing that. Again, so 700 years from now, it's going to be 2 signs off from the sky. And again, when both systems started, they both started at the same point. And again, this isn't really even disputable. So again, without getting into all of that, the Western zodiac, as you would call it, or what we would call tropical zodiac, or basing the zodiac circle on the vernal equinox, which keeps precessing forward, I should say, forward. Right now, it's 24 degrees forward of the sidereal, but again, in 700 years, it'll be 31 degrees forward. It'll be like 2 signs forward. So where in the sidereal sky and the constellational sky, or the sky that hasn't been moving, you would have Aries. In Western astrology, it would actually be Gemini. It wouldn't even be Taurus. It would be 2 signs away. And then before you know it, it's going to be 3 signs, and then it's going to be totally different than the sidereal Nirayana based sky of India, which hasn't changed. So that's the first thing that you recognize, is the zodiac calculation is different. Then besides that, after you get past the zodiac, again, now it's very easy for people who don't practice astrology to think that would be everything. Well, how could you possibly even do astrology if it's a different zodiac? How can the 2 charts be the same? How can the calculations be the same? Or how can it be similar? It has to be one's right and one's wrong, right? Well, no, it doesn't. First of all, astrology in itself are a bunch of systems. The Vedic astrology system, all of those methods are meant to be applied to that calculation. And again, this isn't really even controversial, because in the Vedic astrology texts, where the zodiac is mentioned, which is in most of the important texts, it's mentioned right at the beginning, because it's basically establishing that here's where you start. First, you calculate the zodiac this way. You have nakshatras, and then rashis join the nakshatras. That's the zodiac. They say it before they say anything else. Everything they say after that means you apply everything they say after that to that calculation. That's why they say it at the beginning. This is just good scholarship. Before you're starting to tell people that an Aries is this, or Gemini is this, or this yoga is that, you have to first tell them how to find it, what you're saying, right? So both systems are like this. So the Vedic system is still practiced the way it was conceived of thousands of years ago. We still study the exact same text because it hasn't changed. Because we're still studying Brihad Parashara Horasastra and Brihad Chatika and all the other texts, because they're still based on the same system, the same calculations, and we're still applying it that way. And by the way, it works really well. Nothing wrong with it. Western astrology, again, because it developed, you just take those calculations and apply the methods that people now use in Western astrology. So modern Western astrology still works really well. Those calculations work really well. It can be just as spiritual, just as accurate, all of that. Right? There is no better or worse. And, again, there's ideas these days that, they all made all these mistakes and everybody got it wrong. Again, none of that. These are very fringe opinions anyway. They're not backed up by facts. Anybody who looks into the text can see what happened. It's very clear. It's very clear that two traditions developed, how they developed, why they developed, how the techniques work. For example, Western astrology then developed a whole bunch of house techniques, house systems. They're very prevalent in Western astrology because they're basing their whole calculation on where we are on Earth projected into the three-dimensional space. Where, again, in Vedic, it's much simpler. It's where the planet is on the sidereal ecliptic. Not so much where we are on Earth perceiving it, but where it is on this grid. Again, I'm going to talk more about those differences, but two systems develop. So one isn't better than the other. They're just two distinct systems that developed and they both work. And so one shouldn't get into that kind of idea. But when you talk about how to actually practice it, besides the different calculation, you have the one big difference is Indian astrology is read from the ascendant. Primarily, the main defining factor is the rising sign, the ascendant. That's what everything is organized around. And then the moon is secondary. And then the nakshatra of the moon. Like in Indian culture, if you ask them, like, what's your sign? They'll often say their moon nakshatra. Of course, in Western astrology, it's your sun sign. Everything revolves around sun signs. At least now it does. Again, the thing to understand is that in ancient Western astrology, the way Western astrology was really conceived, it was also supposed to be read from the ascendant, from the rising sign. Now, again, I'm not really sure how it got away from that. I don't want to speculate too much, but certainly something like the precession changing is going to change that idea because it's going to push the ascendant forward now. So maybe this is one of the contributing factors as to why Western astrology is now very codified around the sun, not around the ascendant. Most things in Western astrology, again, professional Western astrologers also still read the chart from the ascendant. At least, to get all the houses and things like that. But it's still a very sun-centric system where you have things like solar arcs and things really revolve around the sun. It's very sun-centric. So this is also something that's different. So trying to understand yourself through Western astrology, you would be looking at your sun sign. Like for me, it's Cancer, right? Can't you tell how emotional and sensitive I am? Cancer sun. And in Western astrology, it winds up being Vedic astrology winds up being Gemini because it's a Gemini rising. So it goes from being Cancer to Gemini because the sun is in one system and the ascendant is one in the other. But oftentimes you'll see that there are big differences, especially if you don't have the sun near the first house. Someone might be this, they might, like if I would have been born, 6 hours earlier, I would still have the sun in Cancer in Western astrology, but my rising sign would probably be Aries in Vedic astrology. So if someone's reading my sign as a Cancer in Western astrology, when they go to do my reading in Vedic, I'm Aries. So it's totally different. That's usually what happens is it's a total different reference point. And again, it doesn't mean one is better than the other or whatever. It's just a different system, right? And again, with Vedic astrology, the system itself is to see the chart in a much more of a three-dimensional way, particularly through that ascendant, because the ascendant also really implicates all the planets as house rulers and all these other things that have much more depth, at least initially. I don't mean more depth than Western astrology, but I mean more depth than the ascendant is in the West, just because it's a different way to read the chart. So that sidereal ascendant is the main thing that you look at. And then the secondary would be the nakshatra of the moon, right? And then the sun is kind of like the third consideration, whereas Western astrology, the sun sign is the most important feature, you would say. And again, these things kind of track a little bit with Eastern and Western culture, particularly Indian and Western culture, where things are much more cosmic, spiritual, connected to infinite, the infinity of time, which, by the way, is much more akin to things like a nakshatra-based zodiac that's related to deities and stars, and then the enormity and infinity of the sky, rather than, again, the Western astrology system. Everything revolves around the sun. The whole zodiac revolves around the sun. The whole zodiac revolves around the earth, the measurement of the earth going around the sun. Everything does. So it's much more sun-centric, I say soul-centric, but more, I don't want to say ego in a negative way, but personality-centric, personal-centric Western astrology, because things have codified very much around the sun, at least as a matter of identity. Now, again, the sun in itself is the actual soul, the supreme self. And again, I'm not knocking Western astrology at all, because it's also very soulful, very beautiful. Great Western astrologers do fantastic soulful work. Nothing like that. All I'm saying, though, is that when the nexus revolves around the sun, it can often be around, like, I'm the important one. Like, me, the sun, my identity, projecting, right? Whereas, again, in the East, you have the ascendant, which, again, you want to know what the ascendant is. The rising sign, the ascendant, is actually literally the sky intersecting with the earth as it's turning. So it's literally, the ascendant is your connection with the sky itself, even if there's no planet there or nothing. It's the intersection of the sky with the eastern horizon. That's literally what the ascendant is. In India, it's called Lagna, which means intersecting point. And it's how, as the earth was turning, that moment you were born, this, where you were on earth, was intersecting with the sky. So it's like, whoosh, your soul came here from the sky, and here's the moment, that exact degree. And what that, again, that nakshatra is, that Rashi, all of that section of the sky. And again, just to say, it's inconceivable that India wouldn't have the sky, integrated this way. Everything is related to the sky, to the sidereal sky. What we would call sidereal, again, it's Nirayana chakra in India, at least that zodiac, but it's just the sky directly. Boom. The Lagna, you're reading it from the sky. That's literally what it is. Where you are on earth at that moment in relation to the sky. And the sky is like eternal. You look in the sky and your gaze goes on for billions of years, right? So that's the connection. That's where the soul is coming in, and that's how you read the chart in that depth. So again, in the West, it's revolving around the sun, which, again, the sun is the soul and all of that, but it's also, the zodiac itself is even pinned to our cycles on the earth. It's very related to the earth and you on the earth. Again, even the zodiac is, which is what we call tropical zodiac, is aligned with the earth going around the sun. So it's really just taking the measurement of the earth going around the sun and measuring all the planets based on that, projecting that into the sky and basing where we look at all the planets through that lens. And so it's much more, you would say, personality, perhaps even egocentric to some extent. At least it can be. And this these two calculations have different, correlations as well. And we can easily see we can easily infer what those things mean when we're drawing up the astrology chart. It's sidereal in India, and the Western system developed around the tropical. and so did the way that we're reading it from the ascendant, which is deeply connected to the sidereal sky. And west, we're reading from the sun, which is deeply connected even to that whole tropical solar sort of nexus. And, a few other things that are big differences. Indian astrology definitely has more of a, certainly it has much more of a connection to Indian thought, Sanatana Dharma, which is the science of, which is the study of the eternal truth. And these things that come through in yoga and Ayurveda and the other Indian sciences. Vedic astrology doesn't just sort of, connect to it. It's inseparable from it. It's part of it. Vedic astrology is, in fact, even a spiritual practice, a yogic practice. A path of yoga is, study. And one of the things we study is things like this. Connecting our limited mind to the cosmic mind is a spiritual practice that's not separate from things like yoga. It's used in Ayurvedic medicine. It's part of it. All the timing of the karma and the sacred and the sanctity of all of it, it's all related. There's no like, oh, well, you're doing astrology. And again, in the West, not only is it not part of it, but it's antagonistic toward the spiritual traditions, the healing traditions. Again, if you're, those who, quote, believe in astrology or practice astrology, maybe you use it that way. But again, I'm talking about culturally. What would let's say, and we live in a religious culture in the West. What would your priest say if he knew you took your spiritual direction from astrology, or other spiritual teachers, or your doctor? Oh, you go to your doctor and you're saying, well, I want to wait until the new moon to do this medicine, or I don't know, let's wait to do my surgery until Mercury's not retrograde. I don't know, whatever the heck it might be. Again, astrology not only is not used, but you would wind up looking like a sort of crackpot in the West. This is not, of course, at all the case in India. So, to say more succinctly, Western astrology has a very uneasy relationship with other kinds of Western healing, whether it be allopathic medicine or spirituality, whether it be, like the church. Western astrology is out there in space in an antagonistic way. Not to mention, of course, in the extreme, the religious views and the, astrology is the devil's work. It's literally like Satan. It's like the worst thing you could ever do. Astrology is literally like satanic. And witches, when you hear about like the witches being burned at the stake and stuff, who do you think were the witches? I mean, who do you think they were? Well, they were astrologers. They were people doing like astrology and divination. They weren't just, people that they pulled out of thin air. They were people who weren't obeying the edicts of the church or whatever, and instead they were doing things like astrology and other kinds of divination. So, of course, that's not the way it is in India. It's a holistic, integrated system. The last important thing, just on a certain, with a certain, technical bent, is Indian astrology definitely, well, part of it is because it's been practiced the same way for so long. And it comes from a very scientific tradition, but it's really it's very much geared around predictive accuracy, and especially as it relates to like the dasha sequence. In Indian astrology, we have the specific timing and dasha cycle and sequence that unfolds. It's like a map of your life that unfolds right when you're born. You can look and see through the entire life just based on when someone was born, and see when these things are going to happen. Now, again, it brings into mind the idea that you have to know what karma is, how karma works. But again, this is unique in to Vedic astrology. Now, there are some timing systems in Vedic astrology. They have their way of timing events and timing things for sure. There used to be a timing system called Fredaria, which I believe it was in Roman. It was medieval astrology. I don't remember the epoch. I'm not a scholar on Western astrology, but and they also time things in different ways with things like progressions and again, like I just said, solar arcs and other kinds of ways, and those things work very well. It's different than the dasha sequences in Indian astrology, which is a very, very profound feature. And these are some of the things that people gravitate toward Indian astrology for. Also, a couple other things. One of the things that Westerners, let me take a drink here. I just got a big mug. Look at this mug. Is this the biggest mug you've ever seen? It says, "I like big mugs," and I cannot lie. One of my students got this for me this weekend. Is that cool or what? I'm drinking some blood. You don't believe me, but it is. It's blood. I drink blood. No, it's not. It's beets. I juiced some beets. Okay, so but Western astrologers or Western astrology students, they're like, what about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto? How could you ever do astrology without Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto? Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Okay, I hear you. You can do it very easily, by the way. And no, they're not in the ancient text, the Indian text. And people say they weren't discovered yet. We don't know if they knew they were there, but they didn't pay attention to them. Part of the reason they didn't pay attention to them is because they're not visible. And Indian astrology places more attention on things that are visible, the visible planets from Sun to Saturn. And you might say, well, what about Rahu and Ketu? They're not visible. Yes, they are. Rahu and Ketu, the lunar nodes, which cause eclipses, you're like, well, they're not visible. They are visible. They're just not visible that often. So when they are visible, it's very important. And in fact, it's kind of breathtaking. When we have eclipses and the nodes become visible, that's very profound. Something that doesn't reveal itself that often winds up being that much more noteworthy, that much more impactful. So the lunar nodes also have an exalted status in Indian astrology because they're not seen that often. When they are seen, they're impactful, and any planets that are near the nodes are near that vortex, that spatial energetic point between the orbits of the sun, moon, and earth. That's what the nodes are. It's that energetic point where the orbits of the sun, moon, and earth interact. Amy Eager says, juicing beets, great for the liver. Yes, indeed. I juice quite a bit. And so this is why, again, so instead of 3 outer planets that aren't visible, the lunar nodes take on an exalted status. Now, again, you could say, well, the lunar nodes are in the Western astrology too. Yeah, they certainly are. The nodes are certainly not as impactful or as prominent in chart analysis as Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, usually. In Western astrologers' mind, if they even mention them, they'll kind of take a whack at the north node, hardly mention the south node. So this is a difference. And aside from the nodes having an exalted status, Vedic astrology has an entire other zodiac, a 27-fold zodiac that exists as the substratum, really, of their entire framework, an entire system. The entire substratum of Vedic astrology and Vedic thinking, Vedic thought, Vedic life is the sky. It's a cosmic practice. It's a cosmic culture. All of the deities, all the entities are metaphysical. It's a whole metaphysical culture related to the sky, the stars, the enormity of time, the big and the small, the infinite. All of this is in their entire culture. It's all about this cosmology. And so, of course, when I say substratum, it's like if you reduce it back to any one thing that's the source of it all, it's the sky. And of course, so that's why it starts with these 27 portions of the sky. Those 27 nakshatra portions are really, in many ways, the kind of foundational measurement that the Indians used. And they broke those nakshatra measurements, those 27 measurements, up into padas as well, 108 portions. And again, this was like the fundamental unit of measurement even back in the Vedas. Again, I'm going to be doing a couple videos here real soon. I'm finishing it up, where I show you this. It's unassailable, the facts and the truth of how everything emanates from that sidereal sky or the Nirayana chakra. So those 27 portions are the fundamental building block. The 12 portions that are put on top of it even are secondary, but of course they're put on top at the same place because it's the same energies. For example, that 30-degree portion of Aries is the same portion of sky where you have Ashwini to 1230. Ashwini to 1320, Bharani to 2640, and then Kritika, the last pada. And then Taurus starts. That's the portion where Kritika goes to 10 degrees, Rohini goes to 2320, then Mrigashira goes into Gemini. Boom. So all of that is aligned. And again, it's said in every Vedic astrology text, the zodiac is always defined that way. And that's the zodiac. So again, even though there's not Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and also asteroids and all of these other things that you get in Western astrology, Vedic astrology has that entire other zodiac, that 27-fold zodiac, 27 nakshatras, add nuance. They don't just add nuance, it's a whole other way of operating. It's not separate, but it's a whole level of depth within the zodiac scheme, the zodiac of 12 signs, a whole different level within that schema. So to think that, well, how could you ever do astrology without Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto it's preposterous to a good Vedic astrologer. I mean, I never miss them. I don't think they're useless. Again, all of it, it's all just part of other systems. You could certainly use them. And I know some Vedic astrologers who use them. Some use them at the expense of understanding other things better, frankly. I'm not going to obviously wouldn't name names or anything, but there's a lot of what's called neo-Vedic astrology where people, one of the things that really happened, and again, it's not a criticism, it's not an insult, it's just a recognition, because I happen to know that a lot of the Vedic astrology in the West started with Western astrologers, decades ago, and they found out about Vedic astrology and all of these things I'm talking about. They found out about, for example, the timing system. Man, all you need to do is look at that look at that dasha sequence, and it's just arresting, because you look at that timing sequence, and even if you don't know exactly how to interpret it, it's like, wow, look at these big shifts that happened right when those dashas changed, and it gets your attention. And then you, first of all, and then you start to even study the zodiac itself, and you understand that the Western zodiac, what's the so-called tropical zodiac, is really an extrapolation from the Earth going around the sun projected into the sky. It's not even congruent with the sky anymore. It's always moving. It was done at a time mainly to try to stabilize the calculation because of the astronomy or whatever, again, and if you and you realize that, again, the tropical zodiac itself, again, I'm not saying it doesn't work, but you start to have epiphanies about what the zodiacs are, and you think, I didn't even know that what we're calling Aries or Taurus isn't in alignment with those sections of the sky anymore. And so this was really what started a lot of the Vedic astrology in the West, was a lot of Western astrologers, again, who were using things like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, using a lot of outer planets. They were already doing that, but then they switched over because Vedic astrology has so much interpretive power, not to mention that it's so connected to the, Indian, all of the metaphysics. But then you also get the 27 nakshatras. It's just fascinating. And then, but what wound up happening, a lot of it is that a lot of the Western astrologers just kept using all the outer planets, many, quite a few at the expense of really understanding how to use the nakshatras really well, or harmonic charts, all of the depth of Vedic astrology. And outer planets become a sort of shortcut, right? And again, I'm not criticizing anyone, but it's just, I see it. But again, you can use outer planets, but if you're doing Vedic astrology, but they shouldn't be a shortcut. They shouldn't be a way to shortcut like understanding Raja Yogas and the planets as house rulers, and how to interpret nakshatras, and how to understand, again, all the harmonic charts, and how to do all of the stuff that, like with myself and my students and other people, we never even missed the outer planets because we're actually doing the Vedic astrology the way it was in the texts. We're doing it the way it was in the texts. And it works fantastic without them. So what I do see with outer planets is you could certainly see them as more maybe generational things or other kinds of things where, but especially for natal charts and things like that, they're not really as developed, I guess you would say. So that's what I wanted to say. These are the main differences between Indian and Western astrology. Of course, you have the zodiac, different calculation, different history. Don't buy into this idea that these people were confused, they didn't know what they were doing, they made all these mistakes. The only people making mistakes are people saying that stuff. You look in the history books, you look at what these were ancient scientists. They knew what they were doing. They all knew what they were doing. Oh, I forgot to mention, I'll just say really quick. When the two cultures were interacting, for example, as Indian astrology was still doing its thing, and Western astrology, especially in Persia and the Arabic world, was being developed, they interacted with each other for hundreds of years and created this amazing system called Tajika astrology, which is the purest blending of the two systems ever. Because you see a lot of what would become like modern Western astrology, but applied with Indian zodiac, Indian principles. And it's very much, you see this total hybridizing where they were just different systems, right? And the Indian astrologers knew of the tropical calculation, quote tropical, because they had it in their system as well, Sayanas, but they didn't use it to calculate the chart. They didn't do it for astrology. The Sayana chakra was meant to keep us in line with the calendar. It wasn't a zodiac. Zodiac was the Nirayana chakra. If you want to define zodiac, zodiac is the sky that everything's moving through. The Sayana chakra is not a zodiac. The Nirayana chakra was the zodiac that they were using to measure things, including the Sayana chakra, including the solstices and equinoxes. They were measuring with the Nirayana chakra. So you see all this is just very plainly shown in all of the text. There's no disagreements about any of this among scholars, people that have researched this and all like that. You see it in all the texts. So two distinct systems developed. One, what we would call sidereal, or that calculation. The other, tropical. And you see the methods that reflect that. You see the methods and the practices that reflect those two systems. But then Vedic became much more focused on the ascendant, which is literally the earth turning, interacting with the sidereal sky. And you read the chart from that. Western really eventually, as it is practiced now, revolves more around reading the sun sign. The whole practice revolves around the sun, including the zodiac, like I said. So it's very sun-centric. Vedic astrology is very ascendant-centric, rising sign, and then moon-centric, because the moon is the mind and how we perceive consciousness. And then you also have, like I said, Vedic astrology also has the 27 Nakshatras, a whole other zodiac behind it. It also has very precise dasha sequence, very precise timing sequence. It also works seamlessly with all the Indian practices. So if you're doing yoga or Ayurveda or meditation, all that stuff, Vedic astrology is the astrological system for that. You know, I see yoga studios, they have pictures of deities up like that. And then the people that know astrology, they're all talking about Western sun signs. They're all talking about Western astrology. It's out of alignment. It's just incongruent. The zodiac of yoga, the zodiac or the astrology of yoga is Vedic astrology. That's what it is. That's why I wrote the book, Yoga and Vedic Astrology. So again, in the West, astrology is hanging out there somewhere in another, loca somewhere. It's hanging out in space. It's antagonistic toward our spirituality, our health in the West. In the East, it's totally congruent, right? West uses the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Also things like asteroids and other kind of things that are getting discovered. India keeps it very precise with the 6 visible planets from Sun to Saturn, 7 including the moon. And then the lunar nodes have an exalted status. They are visible. We just don't see them all the time. So they become very powerful. Singularity, evolutionary forces, very developed in Vedic, not as much in the West, not as much in Western. And then, as I said, the 27 Nakshatras. So these are some things I wanted to highlight. I have a couple students that wanted me to do this as well because they're getting more into teaching and wanting to explain these things better. And so, we have a few questions. There are some Westerners who do moon mansions. Look, one of the things that's happening now is things are coming together. And certainly a lot of Western astrologers using their zodiac and whatnot, and then also adopting nakshatras. That's all great. That's all fantastic. And, so these things are hybridized now. And in ancient Persia, the Persian astrologers, they used nakshatras, they used tropical zodiac, they also used a sidereal zodiac, they used, look, the important thing is to just understand what it is that you're doing. The problem, there have been weird problems and controversies the last few years because people just say things that aren't true. They make things up that aren't correct. They make it out like people were confused and they should have done this and there was all these mistakes and just all this stuff it's just simply not true. The ancient scientists and astrologers and astronomers knew what they were doing, especially when it came to something as simple as the zodiacs. It's not that hard to understand what it is, for God's sake. How could you think that people that made all these complex calculations didn't understand that there were 2 things being measured? Of course they did. So if you see that kind of stuff going on, just ignore it. It's not true. Okay. So people now doing things like, as Lamar said, some Westerners who do moon mansions. Yeah, people do all kinds of stuff. Right. And so we have access to a lot of things now. And that's also why I should, decided to do this. Please explain interpretation of different ascendants for the same person. I'm confused how both could be valid. Well, look, you're asking me to do the impossible. I don't say they're both valid. Look, as an individual, look, they're both calculations are valid. They're two different systems. The best way to look at it is like this. What I just said when I said I'm not saying both are valid, I don't mean they're both valid for the same person. I wouldn't read a chart based on that because I don't use those methods. I don't think it's as accurate. For example, that's why I do Indian astrology. That's why. That doesn't mean for myself, because I see the chart this way, I would be an utter lunatic to say that everybody must see it this way or else they're wrong. No. Other people see it the way they see it, and the way they interpret it is congruent with that way that they see it. And what they say about it is probably correct or mostly correct with the people that they speak to. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in business. So it's just as simple as this. It's like saying, how could Eastern medicine and Western medicine both be correct? Because they're both measuring similar things. Oh, and what I said at the beginning is also important. Everything doesn't revolve around the zodiac signs. You also have houses. You also have planets' relationships to each other. That don't have to do with the zodiac calculation. So everything doesn't have to do with that. If you don't do astrology and you're just saying, well, how could I be a this or that? Or how could someone be a this or that? That in itself is the mistake of thinking, how could they both be right? Because you're looking at a system. It's like saying, how could Ayurveda look at me this way and then an allopathic doctor look at me this way? How could they both be right? Well, because they're different systems. And maybe they're not both right. Maybe you don't think one works very well, which happens to be my view. But that's because that's based on what I would say. The things I would say based on that other calculation would be wrong based on how I see it. So it's just like that. It's not that complicated. It's like any other thing where there are different ways to do it. So if people are hung up about that, it's because they don't really understand astrology so well yet. And they're thinking that everything revolves around a sign, or especially like my sign. It's usually what it is. How could I be a this in here and a that in there? How could it be both? Doesn't make sense. Because you're not I'm not a Cancer or a Gemini. I can see how my Western chart makes perfect sense. Western astrologers have read my chart and it's bang on perfect for what they're doing. It's great. They do a great job. It's just, and I'm not saying that it's wrong or anything else. I'm saying myself as an astrologer and how I see things and how I explain things and how I work does not work with Western astrology. And part of the reason, again, one of the biggest ways is that one of the biggest things that Indian astrology does is, I said it at the beginning, but I'll say it again, is that everything revolves around the ascendant. And it's not just one sign. It's not just a sign. It's that sign in relation to every other one and all of the house rulers. And the planets become very different, much more dynamic in Vedic astrology. And so that's the foundation of Vedic astrology, really, is that dynamic relationship of all of the planets as rulers and all of that, which is not a part of Western astrology. Western astrology sees other things. So I couldn't do that if I tried to do that, I do that on a tropical chart. It doesn't work. None of the rulerships make sense. None of the yogas make sense. There's also different house systems. None of them make sense. Vedic astrology, Indian astrology was full sign, full house system. Everything was nailed to those portions of the sky. This portion of the sky, house and sign. Doesn't matter if it's in 1 degree or 29 degrees or whatever. It's all these segregated portions of the sky. And Western is very different. It's not congruent with the way I see astrology or see the chart. So I don't do it. But yes, both can certainly work. And it's all about how someone, each person's nervous system interacting with the sky and interacting with that cosmic energy. You're certainly welcome, Liz. So Lamar says some use equal house systems. Yes, many are going back now to equal house systems because they're fundamental. And you want to understand something. Equal house systems are the ancient approach. And my feeling is that these equal house systems were there because they were connected to the sky. You want to understand something. Modern house systems in Western astrology are disconnected from the sky, literally. See, this is the reason why Western astrology can exist without any problem being disconnected from literally the sky. I don't mean the constellations, but literally the sky. Because everything in Western astrology is contained within our solar system. All of the signs and houses revolve around things that are calculated based on the Earth going around the sun. And the sky itself isn't there. Early Western astrology, again, which is very much like early Vedic astrology, it was full house, full sign system because they were connected to 12 portions of the sky. That's what full house, full sign is. It's 12 segregated portions of the sky. That's why. The house systems that you get later are disconnected literally from any measurement point in the sky. Instead, it's measuring the sky after Earth. It's kind of like the atmosphere of the Earth. Everything is contained in this kind of globe, this sort of globe. In India, everything is connected to that sky. Everything is nailed to the sidereal ecliptic, nailed to a portion of the grid. It doesn't matter where it is. If it's at this portion of the grid, in that section, this is the sign. And then all the signs are all the houses are within those signs. And all of that is nailed to the Nakshatras. Boom, boom, boom. It's all nailed like this. Boom, boom, boom. All of it. Western, it's not. Not only is the zodiac itself moving based on the precession, but then the houses themselves are all uneven based on where we were on Earth. So everything is based on the Earth with the houses in Western astrology. In India, all of that is bypassed. It's the sky directly. And these portions that are nailed to the nakshatra, nailed to 0, Ashwini and Aries starts the whole thing. It starts 27 nakshatras and 12 rashis, and they line up, boom, like that. And so that puts house and sign on this sort of grid. So there is no need to so I think this is one of the reasons why there's a return to, I think, at least in principle, one of the reasons why some ancient, or those who study ancient Western astrology, this is one of the things that's lost with the house systems, is a purity of a connection to the sky directly. So anyway, so there's a few other questions here. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And so anyway, I hope this was helpful for people to hear, and share it with others if you think this was helpful information. A lot of people ask me about the differences between Western and Vedic astrology, how to understand, especially a Western chart. These are the important differences, and I hope this was enjoyable to listen to.